The big six teams in the Premier League have been big for some time, but recently a couple of them have not been that good. So today I'm joined by JJ Bull
Hello.
and John Mackenzie to ask the question, is the era of the big six in the Premier League finally over? Now, John, it's hard to think of a time when the big six didn't dominate the Premier League, so it feels weird to think that that might be the case now. But it hasn't always been the case, has it?
It hasn't, no. And what I've done is I've drawn up a timeline to have a think about how we talked about the Premier League elite through the ages. I started my timeline in the 1980s because this was the point at which a so-called Big Five emerged in the media. Do you want to guess who that Big Five were back in the 80s?
Man United.
Yep.
Liverpool.
Yep.
Chelsea.
Nope.
No.
Everton.
Everton.
Everton is one, yeah.
Arsenal.
Yep.
And Liverpool.
You said Liverpool.
Did I?
Yeah.
Liverpool twice.
Spurs is the final one. So
yes,
two derbies and then Manchester United there as well. It sort of became the consensus that these teams were going to be the ones who were going to win the league. That brings us to the beginning of the Premier League era. Now at the beginning, actually maybe should have included the big one because Manchester United pretty much dominated from the beginning of the formation of the Premier League.
Apart from Blackburn Rovers, of course.
Blackburn Rovers in there as well, of course.
Big one is also your nickname.
Right, that is true.
It's true. But then in 1996, something very important happens.
Arsene Wenger happens.
Arsene Wenger happens, that's right. So Arsene Wenger arrives at Arsenal and then suddenly the monopoly of Manchester United becomes a duopoly. So we start seeing Arsenal, Manchester United switching places at the top of the table.
And a great era it was, John.
Great era, but what we start then seeing is just a gradual increase in the teams who are considered the top teams. So by the end of this period, you got the Invincibles season of 03-04, that's the last one that Arsenal win. Liverpool start getting big at this point, so they have their treble. Another moment on the timeline, 2003.
Roman Abramovich.
You know all the answers, Joe.
I do.
You know all the answers. So Roman Abramovich buys Chelsea and starts putting money into them. And what we end up with then between 2004 and 2009 is that the top four era, as we called it. You'll remember that era. We called it a top four era because the top four always finished in the top four spots between 2004 and 2009, apart from one season. 2005, what happened in 2005?
Leicester City won the league.
No, Everton finished in the top.
That's right, of course, the David Moyes era.
The David Moyes era. But beyond that, in that period, it was constantly the top four finishing in the top four spots.
But then it changes again, John.
Yeah, 2008, 2009, that's the season when Sheikh Mansour buys Manchester City. So you've got another big money club in the Premier League now. But also another club actually makes a case that it should be considered in the best teams in the country.
Tottenham. That one's easy. That one's not even a quiz question. That's just too easy.
But that was actually the Harry Redknapp era at Spurs.
I prefer to think of it as the Van der Vaart era.
The Van der Vaart era, yeah, sure. Obviously then taken over by Pochettino later on, and Spurs really cement themselves in that top six. And again, I've called it the top six because what we're talking about here is the biggest teams in the country actually consistently finishing in the top six spots. So I've got this graphic here, which just goes season by season, showing you where the big six teams finished in the league. And as you can see, 2018-19 is I think the watershed here, because up until that point, generally speaking, the big six teams are finishing in the top six places.
Hence why we're calling them the top six.
That's why we're calling them the top six. There are a few seasons where Liverpool finish outside the top six, but they're finishing seventh and eighth. Yeah. And then there's a Man United seventh place finish as well. There's the outlier season of 2015-16, which is when Leicester City win the league. And after that, clearly the big six sides want to reassert their dominance. So we have 3 seasons there where they're finishing 1 to 6. So this very much, I think, is the top six era. The biggest teams in the country generally finishing around the top 6 spots.
So what changes then?
What changes then is once we start looking at the where these teams are finishing, it becomes a lot more open, I think. So you can see from 2019-20 to last season, there's only one season where the big six finish in the top 6 spaces, and we can see there's teams actually dropping much lower. So a couple of 8th place finishes, but 12th place finish from Chelsea in 22-23, along with a couple of 8th place finishes from Spurs and Manchester United in recent seasons.
And this season is going to be a lot starker. If we had that added and it was finished already,
it
would be wild to look at.
Yeah, because Manchester United and Spurs are not even going to finish in the top half of the table. So it feels as though there has been this shift. And as a result, on the timeline, I've distinguished between the top 6 and the big 6, because it no longer makes sense to talk about the biggest 6 teams as the top 6 because they're not consistently finishing in the top 6 spots. Now you might say to me, well, if we look at the period in question, those last 7 seasons, the big 6 have actually picked up the most points. So that sort of suggests that there is a top six. So we can see the big six have finished with the most points in that time frame. But actually, if we only consider the last 3 seasons, we can see that a slightly different picture emerges, because now, after Man City, Arsenal and Liverpool, what we've got is Newcastle and Villa picking up more points than the other members of the big six.
So just to clarify, this means cumulatively in the last 3 seasons, Newcastle and Aston Villa have picked up more points than Man United, Chelsea and Tottenham.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, and so that raises the question of whether or not what we're seeing here is just a randomness of a couple of teams performing quite well, or whether or not what we're going to start seeing, I think, is a change in the actual build-up of the big six. Could it be the case that Villa and Newcastle, who both have very rich owners, could actually break into that group of the biggest teams in the Premier League?
Well, that's my question, because the big six are no longer the top 6, but they are still big.
Yeah.
As considered by the big six.
Yes, and it all comes down to money, because the distinction between the big six and the top 6 is that the big six can continue to spend money on their squad so that they can have the better players even when they take a performance hit, whereas the top 6 is always based on performance over a period, I would say.
Okay, so JJ, as John's established, money still plays a central role in teams being big, but maybe in recent seasons a little less of a central role, seemingly, in making teams top.
I understand what you mean. So I have a study of why money is important. So there is an established theory that the higher wages you pay, the higher you finish in the league. It kind of equates over time, so not always exactly there. And if we look at the Premier League wages, what we see is kind of what we'd expect. City, United, Chelsea, Arsenal, they pay all the most wages, and they tend to finish in the top 6. This is the top 6 finishes in the past 30 years. So you can see that's kind of what the top wages are. However, as we're saying, this is over time. So these are their wages currently for the 24-25 season, but this does not correlate with the league positions, because as you'll observe from the real league table, there are a few anomalies. For example, Manchester United and Tottenham are nowhere near where they should be. Everton and West Ham are also having really poor seasons, are way below where they should be. But Bournemouth, Brighton and Brentford, and probably Fulham as well, are performing well above where they should be compared to what their wages they're paying their players are. And in fact, Bournemouth, according to underlying numbers, should be 4th in the league, which is way higher than you'd really expect, and this shouldn't really happen, especially when you consider the money that the big 6 teams have. Now, how did this happen? Well, the reason is because the big teams got stupid, while the small teams get smart. And they did things like focusing on clever recruitment, data analysis. They brought in loads of clever off-pitch people to help make the on-pitch people better. They have less money to spend on individual transfers, so they started looking for value in other markets and just finding ways to value people higher than other people see them. So the Moneyball approach basically is what's happened. And what you see is Man United not doing that. They focused on the commercial aspect. The footballing division got left behind. They have anecdotally, I've read that their data department and recruitment department is just disparate and all over the place. No one knows who's really in charge of anything. It's a bit of a mess. And so what you see in the pitch is kind of a representation of that behind the scenes. And Bournemouth's a good example of who's done it really well, because that's little Bournemouth. They're very small and on the coast.
Yeah.
Sunny there.
You could get a lovely tan.
Perhaps that's what attracted Eddie Mitchell to the club in 2009. So he started putting things in place to make them better, stabilise them, got them out of debt. Then he brought in a guy called Maxim Devine, who has lots of money, and he's helped fund their rise from League 2, League 1, Championship to the Premier League where they are now. They went down again. And then someone called the Black Knight Football Club, which I believe is owned by Batman, took them over, and now he's putting far more money into them, and they're currently performing at a really high level.
Yeah.
Now what's interesting is that because Bournemouth are in the Premier League and they have a little money, they had to find these smaller players to make them bigger and better. But the Premier League is very, very wealthy. So what you have is Brighton, who are also a kind of relatively small club. You'd think in European terms.
Yeah.
I often think of things in European terms.
Me too.
Brighton brought in more revenue in the 23-24 season than Roma.
Wow.
You heard of them? And Benfica.
Because they're in Rome.
And Benfica is in Portugal. Lisbon, yes. That's right. But these things are now run like businesses. The Premier League is very, very wealthy, and now you have people running them like a business. How wealthy is it? Well, the Premier League is so wealthy that in 2024, Spurs earned more than Juventus and Napoli combined. That's how wealthy the Premier League is.
That's crazy.
Yeah, Spurs earned 615 million euros, but combined, those two clubs took in 609 million euros.
How much of that came from Beyonce, though?
Well, let's find out, because the reason Spurs were able to make that much revenue compared to those gigantic clubs is that they diversified income streams and strategic commercial initiatives. My words. What does that even mean? It means that they took in 193 million euros in broadcasting, because the Premier League's popular. That's where the money is coming from. They watch it around the world, Joe. and 123 million euros in match day revenue. But there's a missing bit of money to pick up the rest, and that is because they took in 297 million euros in commercial revenue.
Yeah.
Because the big money now is in stadiums. I took that picture. That's a stadium.
Did you?
I did, yeah.
Which stadium's that?
That's the Spurs stadium.
Oh, great.
The one I was talking about.
That's relevant
at the
to
time.
this.
It is relevant.
Yeah.
And this means that because the stadium brings in so much money to them, that the Red Hot Chili Peppers helped fund the signing of Lucas Bergvall.
It fits. It treads, doesn't it?
It does. And actually, the stadiums are interesting because that's how like teams in the Big Six had it considered. They're very prestigious, they've got lots of history, and that's what helps make them part of the Big Six, I think. But then their stadiums then also help them generate so much revenue that they can't really leave the Big Six, really, because it's just going to generate so much wealth. And if you look at the Big Six, the stadiums kind of correlate with where they are as a football club. For example,
Tell me more.
Man City inherited a fancy stadium, then they redeveloped the area around it, and that's what's come up. They're now an established super team. Liverpool redeveloped Anfield, all the history, the prestige.
Yeah.
They've just made it better, supercharged it. Arsenal built the Emirates, went through austerity to do it, but now they're enjoying the benefits.
Yeah.
One day maybe we will too. Chelsea are trying to build a new stadium with large investment funding. That's what the club's doing.
Yeah. But they can't get it right.
They can't get it right.
Because of the tube.
Yeah.
Because of the
It's
tube.
too many trains. Spurs built a spaceship, don't really know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And Man United's roof is falling in.
It's very wet in there, I've heard.
Yes. Basically, the commercial revenue that these Big Six teams can take in because of the Premier League being broadcast everywhere, it means they kind of have consolidated power, and things like stadiums allow them to generate even more wealth, which means that even when they fall off a bit, their revenue is so high that they are always going to be in the Big Six, I would say.
Too big to fail.
Perhaps.
Thanks, JJ. That was very interesting. You know what else is interesting? Phil Hay. Or what he has to say. What is it, Phil?
You'll remember Roberto De Zerbi's reign at Brighton, and you'll probably remember that it all ended for him there in slightly volatile fashion. He's coaching Marseille in France these days, and you'll be pleased to hear that he hasn't changed. At one point this season, he threatened to randomly quit. At another point, he refused to turn up for a training session, and his squad declined to take part as a result. They're trying to qualify for the Champions League, and they're under pressure big time. To get away from the chaos, and to find some peace and quiet, De Zerbi decided to take his players for a training camp in Rome. But he managed to time it for exactly the same week that the Pope died. Not exactly a break from the masses. If you like this story, or if you'd like more stories like it, sign up for the Athletic FC newsletter, clicking on the link below. We'll be in your inbox Monday to Friday.
Hey, thanks, Phil Hay. So, John, we've established the difference between the Big Six and the top six. I mean, the next natural question here is, can a team go from the top six to the Big Six? Is it possible to Big Six yourself?
Well, as we saw at the beginning of the show, there's a couple of teams who have actually broken into the top six in Villa and Newcastle, who I think...
Into the top six?
Into the top six. Not
Yeah.
the big question is, can they break into the Big Six?
Into the Big Six.
Interestingly enough, both of those teams have very rich owners who, particularly Villa, actually put a lot of investment into their team. And as JJ, I think, has really clearly explained, what we're talking about when we're talking about the Big Six is these teams who have revenue streams that are going to continue regardless of your performances. So you're still going to be able to make enough money to spend money on your squad. The big question is, how do Newcastle and Villa get to a point where they're able to generate the same kind of revenues in order to be able to achieve the same status?
And that was the big question, not the top question.
That's the big question, not the top question.
Just checking, okay, good.
There's an issue here, though, because these two teams do have money available. So the solution here would just be, well, spend more money on your team, make them better. The issue is that PSR exists. Now, PSR, as we all know, is...
Profit and sustainability rules.
Profitability and sustainability rules.
Come on, that is so pedantic.
It's half a mark. As we all know, PSR basically means that each club can make £105 million worth of losses over a 3-year accounting period. Now, that sounds pretty complicated and boring. The way that I think about it is that essentially, if we think about the money that teams are spending on their squads as a river,
Coming down from a mountain.
Coming down from a mountain. So you would want to think that you could spend as much money as you want so that river flows freely. The Premier League have basically built a dam across that river to slow down the flow of monies into your club.
Yeah.
The big question of how you actually arrive then into the Big Six, for me, is how well you can overcome that dam, how you can push extra water over the dam into the
top of the
reservoir. Two great examples of this. So we're talking about two teams recently who've broken into the Big Six, Manchester City and Spurs. Manchester City did it by spending money. They're currently going through the courts because the question is whether or not they spent that money quicker than they should have done, whether or not they found loopholes to get around the dam. Spurs did it through performances, and actually the quality of their performances as a club being enough that then their owner could invest money in a smart way in order to justify getting all of that revenue as well. So,
AKA Pochettino rose the water level and some dribbled over the top.
That's right, yeah. He basically made the squad more valuable than it maybe the wage budget suggested it should be. So there are ways of breaking into that Big Six, I would say. The question is whether or not Newcastle and Villa can do it, because I think PSR much stricter now than it was. So Chelsea bought back in 2003 were able to do it relatively easily. It's much harder now for Newcastle to actually make sure that they're pushing more of that water over the dam to get down to the reservoir. Now I think there's two different ways that Newcastle and Villa can do that. The first one is by being smart with their squad, raising the value of their squad by putting in good performances so that their players become worth more. But the issue is that it's actually quite hard to do that, and I would say very time consuming. So let's take a look at this graph here, which just shows you how much each team has spent on their current squads. It actually was those costs from last season, but
this is how much they've actually spent to
they've
assemble
actually
the
spent,
squads.
yeah. So Chelsea spent 1.5 billion to assemble the squad that they have right now.
Yes.
Villa and Newcastle right down here below the Big Six. Understandably, they've not been able to spend as much on their squad as they would have liked because
they're
of
not bringing
PSR.
enough money in.
Right.
Yeah.
So in order to spend more, they would need to bring more in. They need to raise the revenues, or they could do it through raising the value of their squads. Now, when it comes to Aston Villa, I think this is a really interesting example of why it's such a slow and laborious process. I've got a quote here from Chris Weatherspoon, who is our football finance writer at The Athletic. What he's talking about here is over the past 5 seasons, Villa have spent 652 million on new players, which is the 6th highest in England at that time. But if we go back to our graphic, we can see despite spending more than clubs like Manchester City, their squad is still nowhere near as expensive as those team squads. So the big reason for this is because they've had to sell players as well, right? Because if you raise the value of your squad by playing good football, you can only realise that once you sell those players on.
Yeah.
There's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. One, to reinvest money in your own squad. The problem is that you've got to get that right all the time.
And even if you did do that right all the time, you're only really raising the value of your squad incrementally, because as better players are coming in, good players are going out.
That's right. And the other thing that I would say on this is that PSR limits exist. So the end of every season, teams have to make sure that they've not spent more than they should. And so often what teams have to do to make sure they bring their losses down to an acceptable limit, remember that £105 million limit, is sell players as well. And the problem is that to do that, you generally have to sell your better players, because your better players are going to be the ones who are worth more. There is a caveat here in that if you sell your homegrown players, they make a lot of value for you in PSR terms as well. So what we've seen is a lot of clubs talking about selling the players that they develop through their academies, because that's a really good way of getting beyond that PSR limit as well. But the reality remains that in order to generate value through your squad, you have to play well for a while, you have to sell your players well, and you have to reinvest that money well as well.
And you have to keep doing it over and over and over again.
Yeah, so it's a slow process, and it's difficult. One final thing on this as well is when you do this well and you're making your squad worth more, you're raising the value of your squad, but you're also actually increasing your costs, because to build a better squad, you need to spend more on wages. You have to pay the players more. And so this is a really nice graphic again from one of Chris Weatherspoon's pieces, where if we look at Villa and Newcastle, we can see that yes, they've had really good performances recently. Their squad value is probably increasing. The problem that has come from that is that they've had to massively up their wage bill as well. So even when you get it right, and you raise the value of your squad, you're reducing the actual profits that you're making, because you have to pay more for that as well.
Yeah, okay.
Now, the other area where they can make value, I'd say maybe a little bit more easily, a little bit more quickly, and a little bit more cleanly even, is in competition. So the Champions League, I think, is a massive example of the way that these sorts of teams can generate revenue to be able to keep their better players, not fall foul of the PSR windows as well.
Because you earn so much money from being in.
That's right. So
that's actually why Aston Villa tried to win the Champions League this year.
That would make sense though, wouldn't it? Yeah. And where did they got to the quarterfinals, didn't they?
Yeah, they're not doing it right.
Very impressive.
Yeah, and as Chris Weatherspoon points out in this piece, he says Villa are estimated to have earned more than 70 million from their exploits, ensuring that they, like Newcastle last season, will top 300 million in income for the first time. So we're talking about revenue now. Their revenue stream is getting bigger because they're winning this competition. And outside of the Big Six, they're the only two English clubs to have managed the feat. So it suggests that by going around having good performances in the Champions League, they're doing a good job of maybe breaking into that Big Six, making it a Big Eight. But the problem here is that, as we've seen from Villa and Newcastle, they've been able to get into the Champions League, but in those seasons where they're in the Champions League, they've struggled to actually consolidate their position in the top 4 or 5, which determines them getting back in the following season. Now, Villa,
they don't necessarily have the squad depth in order to maintain that in the way that the Big Six teams do.
Exactly.
Right? So it's almost unfair.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why it's just so difficult to break into that Big Six grouping, because they have the revenue to be able to protect themselves from performance drop-offs. Whereas essentially for Villa and Newcastle to achieve that, they're going to have basically perfect performance and squad recruitment for the next 5 years or so, I would imagine.
Which is unlikely. Okay, I mean, the next natural question then is, if it's very, very difficult to Big Six yourself, is it possible to un-Big Six yourself? I mean, I'm thinking specifically of teams like Manchester United, who appear to be trying very hard to do that, and maybe Spurs, who are also languishing near the bottom of the league at the moment. What's the likelihood that those teams will fall out of the Big Six, or is it possible?
Yeah, I guess this comes down to the question of whether or not you can reduce your revenue to a point where it becomes functionless, because the Big Six, they're able to just continually spend money on their squad regardless of performances. And I think Manchester United are a great example of this, right? Because if we look at the amount they've spent on their squad, that's the third most in the league last season. And then if we look at the wages, you can see that they've got the third highest wage budget in the league as well. So they are spending money as though they are a Champions League side.
But they're not.
But they're not a regular Champions League appearer.
I mean, they're a very irregular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On top of the fact that they generate a lot of revenue, they do operate at quite considerable losses a lot of the time, right? So they don't get the full benefit that their revenue gives you. And it's worth saying as well that, you know, this was always their strength. They were always the biggest revenue producer in English football. They've actually ceded that position to Manchester City recently. Arsenal, I think, are hot on their heels now as well, having had a pretty successful few seasons. Liverpool will no doubt start jumping up now that they've won the Premier League again. And that's the issue, is that eventually the revenue will dry up, because the revenue is, whilst it's based on prestige is still based around this concept of performance in some sense. You have to perform well as a football club to be a popular football club, and you know we've now
in a relevant time period.
Yeah, and we've got generations of kids now coming through supporting teams like Manchester City. So gradually, when those kids become able to spend money, we're going to start seeing a shift, I think, away from that as well. So the big question for Manchester United is, how do they start getting? They're in the same situation as Villa and Newcastle, right? In that, actually, if you look at the squad that they have, which is purportedly a Champions League level squad, I think a lot of people would think that's around maybe worse than Villa and Newcastle squads.
I mean, I think that's an easy argument to make.
So the issue that they're in now is that they need to have the cash flow to be able to improve their squad in the same way that Villa and Newcastle do. And the way that they're not able to benefit from their revenue from doing that, so it feels like they've got to get back into winning games again. So it does feel very much to me that the Manchester United solution has always been, well, we just need to bring in a manager who fixes us. If the manager can do that, then we'll be a Champions League team again and competing at the highest level. Then we'll start bringing in that revenue in order to enable us to sort of justify the means within which we're living. But they've just not managed to do that. And I do think we're at a real point in time now where it's becoming a question, like, how do Manchester United get their squad to such a level that it matches the sort of expenditure that they're making? A big part of that is to do with player sales, right? We've talked about how you can raise the value of your squad by selling your better players. The issue with Manchester United, as we've just said, is they have a Champions League value squad, but they're not performing as a Champions League squad, which means they're devaluing their players. And this has been an age-old problem for them. So if we look at the profit made on players over the last 10 years, Manchester United is 17th amongst English clubs. This is the issue, right? You're devaluing your squad, and then you don't have the ability to then regenerate that squad into better players. So, yeah, I think for Manchester United, really this, despite the fact that Jim Ratcliffe is trying to make cost-cutting changes, they're just going to make a small dint in the amount of debts that they have, the interest payments they have to make. So the reality is that the only way this is going to happen for them is is by making those performance changes. And as we said, it takes time. You've got to get things right. You have to often sell your best players. Last summer we were talking about selling Garnacho, who had been probably the best player from the season before. It's going to be really tough for them to get back to the level that their expenditure suggests they should be at.
Well, what about Spurs then? Because they're sort of struggling in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. What Spurs have done super well, I would say, is they've managed to get to the top level through performances and then make financial decisions that have meant they can bump their revenue right up so that they can absorb a few seasons of poor performances. The issue is that they're having increasingly poor performances in seasons. So I've got, again here, this is a viz which just shows you Spurs' performance against their wage budget. So when you see the green numbers, it means that they've finished higher than their wage budget suggests that they should. If you look at the Pochettino era, they were consistently doing that. That afforded them the ability to make those smart financial decisions. But what we start seeing creeping in once Pochettino leaves is Spurs finishing below the level that you would expect with their wage budget. And I guess the big question is going to be, how do they come out of this period? And again, it's going to be performances. They need to find a manager who's going to take the squad that they have and make it competitive. They've had the lowest wage budget to turnover ratio of most of the big clubs in Europe, but the managers they've had have been able to get more out of the players than you might expect, and that means that they've been able to hold their value. They've got to do the same thing again. I think they've got to bring in a manager who can get those good performances, because the beauty of what they do is they're not having to sell their players every season. They've performed well enough to create huge amounts of value in players. So what Viz here shows you, Gareth Bale, they sold him in 13-14. That then gave them the money to be able to not sell players for a few seasons. They did the same with Kyle Walker, and then they didn't sell players for a few seasons. So what they're really good at doing is using their performances to prevent themselves just becoming a selling club and getting into those cycles where you end up just losing your best players all the time. But yeah, the big question now is whether or not they can get back to that kind of level. They're buying a lot more younger players now, which suggests that maybe they are entering the selling player era. But yeah, they've got to get a manager who gets more out of those players. That's the long and short of it for Spurs.
And yet, despite the position that they're in, they are still unequivocally a big team, aren't they? I mean, JJ, to the question that we asked at the beginning of the episode, is the era of the Big Six over? I think there are two different ways of answering this, aren't there? Because on the evidence, on the one hand, as we've heard from everything you've said and everything John said, the Big Six teams are still the Big Six teams. The real question becomes, is the era we're moving into still to be defined by fans as the era of the Big Six, like it was the era of the top four? What do you think the next era will be known as?
Well, I think it depends on how many Champions League spaces there are, because that'll be what the top five is referred to, and then because there's one extra, you make that the six, really. I think if we look at the Premier League wages again, we see that there are, like, Man United are well out of it, so we can discount them. Chelsea have dropped off a little bit this season. I don't think they're going to be out of it completely. A couple of clever signings, they could be in it next season. What you're probably going to get is Arsenal, Liverpool and Man City are the ones competing for the title with Chelsea. I think for a little while now, there'll be a top four. Everyone else below that is kind of bunched up, but there's about 7 or 8 teams that are all bunched in the same amount of revenue, who with a couple of smart signings could be there. I don't think anyone will dominate like Man City have, probably ever again. I think it'll be a lot of swaps, not only for the top 3 positions, but the top 7 or 8. It'll just randomly change.
I mean, John, to you then, maybe the notion here of a top 3, top 4, what does that mean for the bigs? If we've sorted the tops, then what about the bigs? Is it still a Big Six, or could it be a Big 8?
Yeah, I think we're definitely entering an era where clubs are going to break into that Big Six from a financial point of view. I think that it all boils down, as we've said, to performance. So I think when we're talking about teams like Villa and Newcastle, I think it's if they can continue to actually consolidate their place in Champions League spots over the next few seasons. Maybe it will take them a little bit of back and forthing, finishing in one season and out the next. But I think there will come a point at which their squads are able to compete both on the league front, but also the Champions League front. And once they get to that point, effectively they'll be able to just drive their revenue up. And once their revenue is up, that will just form a buffer for them, so they can have maybe a few seasons where they don't perform as well, but still spend the same amount of money on their squad. So yeah, I think we're in the era of probably, I'd say the top 3. I think those are the teams that are going to challenge for titles, but I think we're entering an era of maybe a Big 8 or so. But I guess the big question is, at the end, at some point, all of the Premier League teams are just going to slowly be consumed in this big group. So then the question becomes, where do we start determining the differences between that? Or do we just simply mean that the Premier League has arrived as a Super League at that instance?
I think you'll find actually that's the top question.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.